Okay, so today we're diving into something pretty heavy, I think.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking about the potential for war with Iran.
Mm-hmm.
And we're doing it based on the analysis of Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson.
Right.
We've been talking about him a bit recently. He's Colin Powell's chief of staff during the Iraq War and before.
Yeah.
And, we've talked about some of his really interesting and insightful views on that.
Yeah.
But he also has a lot to say about Iran.
Yeah, definitely. And it's not just, him speculating or something.
Right.
This is based on his experience, years of experience in the military and government.
Right.
And, he's been involved in wargaming exercises.
Right.
Actually simulating these kinds of conflicts.
Right.
So it's a really informed perspective.
Yeah. And, a lot of times when we talk about these complex geopolitical situations, it can feel really overwhelming, right?
Yeah.
You're bombarded with all this information, all this jargon.
Right.
And it's hard to get a clear picture of what's actually going on.
Exactly.
So what we're trying to do with this deep dive is to cut through all that noise.
Yeah.
And really get to the core of what Wilkerson is saying about the possibility of a war with Iran.
Yeah, and provide some clarity.
Yeah.
So you can understand the stakes, the potential triggers, the realities of what such a conflict might look like.
Right.
And, the consequences, which are, they're pretty serious.
Yeah.
So where are we getting all this from? Well, mainly from a recent YouTube interview where Wilkerson really lays out his thinking on Iran.
Right.
And, we're going to be pulling out the key points, the really insightful stuff that helps us understand the situation.
So let's start with Wilkerson's initial take on the military capabilities involved here, right?
Sure.
There's this common perception, maybe you've heard it too, that the Iranian Air Force is kind of decrepit.
Right.
It's outdated. They have a lot of fighters dating back to the time of the Shah.
Mm-hmm.
And that would lead you to believe that an aerial bombing campaign would be pretty straightforward.
Yeah, like we saw in Iraq.
Right. Exactly. Like we saw with the sanctions and everything.
Uh-huh.
It would be easy to just, go in there and cripple their Air Force.
Right.
But Wilkerson pushes back on that pretty hard.
Yeah, he immediately challenges that assumption.
Yeah.
He says, an aerial bombing campaign, it's not going to be that simple.
Right.
And the main reason, the big obstacle, is the air defense systems that Russia has provided to Iran.
So this is where it gets interesting, right?
Yeah.
Wilkerson claims that, there was this recent Israeli attempt to strike Iran.
Right, which was widely reported as a success.
Yeah.
But he says, according to his sources, that's not really true.
Right.
They didn't actually inflict that much damage.
Oh, I know.
Well, because of those Russian air defense systems. He suggests that those Israeli pilots, they encountered radar systems that they just couldn't counter. They couldn't jam them.
So their SEAD capabilities.
Right.
That's suppression of enemy air defense.
Right.
It wasn't enough.
Yeah, they weren't able to clear a path.
Wow.
To actually get into Iranian airspace and hit their targets.
So what systems are we talking about here specifically?
Well, Wilkerson indicates that Iran probably has both the S-300 and potentially even the S-400 system.
The S-400, that's the really advanced one, right?
Yeah, that's the one that's considered a game changer.
Right.
It can track and engage targets at much longer ranges.
Right.
And it's supposed to be much more resistant to jamming.
Right.
Than the older systems.
So that's why those Israeli SEAD tactics didn't work?
Yeah, exactly. And this is part of a larger trend that Wilkerson points out, which is kind of alarming.
Oh.
He's seeing in places like Ukraine, in the Middle East, that Chinese and Russian military equipment is actually outperforming American equipment.
Really?
Yeah, and it's doing it at a much lower cost.
So, they're getting more bang for their buck.
Yeah, essentially. And it's having a real impact. He even mentions how India is reportedly going back to Russia for arms.
That's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, it's a sign of how things are shifting in the global military landscape.
So this whole idea of an easy aerial campaign, it's out the window.
Yeah, it's much more complicated than people might think.
Okay, so if that's the case, then where do we go from here?
Well, this leads to Wilkerson's next point, which is pretty sobering, honestly.
Okay.
And it comes directly from his experience with wargaming exercises.
Right, he's actually simulated this.
Yeah. He was wargaming a potential conflict with Iran.
Okay.
Alongside a retired Marine lieutenant general, someone he used to work for, so a very credible voice.
Right.
And they ran these simulations multiple times.
Right.
And the consistent conclusion every single time was this: the United States would lose a war with Iran.
Wow. Just like that.
Yeah, that was the outcome, repeatedly.
That's a pretty direct and unsettling assessment.
Definitely. And they looked at various scenarios.
Right.
One of the Iranian responses they considered was targeting a U.S. aircraft carrier.
Oh, wow.
You know those massive ships that are kind of the symbol of American naval power?
Yeah.
And the potential human cost of such an attack? It was staggering.
Yeah, can imagine.
The simulations projected as many as 5,000 U.S. casualties.
5,000. That's huge.
Yeah. And there's another really troubling detail that came out of these discussions.
What's that?
Apparently, the U.S. Navy's fleet of escort ships, the ones that protect the aircraft carriers,
Yeah.
they've been reduced so much that if, say, 2,000 sailors ended up in the water after an attack, we might not have enough capacity to rescue them all.
You mean there wouldn't be enough room on the escort ships?
Exactly. Not enough space to pick up that many people.
Wow.
And, you know, he also mentions the recruitment challenges the U.S. military is facing right now.
Okay.
So the force could be stretched thin, you know, with all these commitments around the world.
So even if they'd managed to rescue those sailors, what then?
Well, Wilkerson's prediction about the U.S. reaction is not very encouraging. He thinks that instead of, you know, taking a step back, reassessing, trying to de-escalate,
Right.
the most likely response would be to double down.
You mean escalate?
Yeah, escalate the conflict.
Into a full-blown war.
Yeah, potentially.
So let's talk about that. What would the scale and scope of a full-fledged war with Iran look like?
Well, if you thought Iraq and Afghanistan were long and costly,
Yeah.
Wilkerson suggests that Iran would be on a whole different level.
Really?
Yeah. He's talking about upwards of $10 trillion.
10 trillion. That's insane.
Yeah. And 10 years, maybe more, to even achieve some kind of stability
Yeah.
to pacify the country.
Wow. Why would it be so much worse than Iraq or Afghanistan?
Well, he emphasizes Iran's strategic depth.
Meaning?
They have a lot of territory to cover. It's a large country.
Right.
And it's not as easy to just go in and, you know, occupy.
Right.
He also points out that it's a largely Persian population with a relatively high degree of homogeneity compared to, say, Iraq, which was very divided along sectarian lines.
Right.
So it's not as easy to exploit those kinds of divisions in Iran.
I see. And what about ground troops? Would we need to deploy them?
That's a tricky question. Wilkerson talks about, you know, historical U.S. military planning against the Soviet Union in Iran.
Okay.
And he focuses on the terrain, specifically the Zagros Mountains. He knows this terrain well
Right.
from his time in the military, and he says it's incredibly difficult.
So it wouldn't be like Iraq or Afghanistan.
No, not at all. Much more challenging.
Okay. And then there's the whole issue of neighboring countries, right?
Exactly. You can't just operate in a vacuum.
Yeah.
Wilkerson points out that the current Iraqi government, they're pretty aligned with Iran.
Yeah.
So Iraq wouldn't be a viable staging ground for a U.S. invasion.
Right. Not like it was in 2003.
Right. And then there's the U.S. presence in Syria, which is a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, what about that?
Well, Wilkerson mentions how Trump, when he was president, controversially said that the U.S. was in Syria mainly to secure oil, and that oil was going to Israel.
Wow.
So it's a complicated picture.
Yeah, it is. So given all that, what are some of the potential triggers that could actually start this war?
Well, one scenario that Wilkerson highlights is a significant Iranian strike on Israel.
Okay.
Something that inflicts a lot of casualties.
Right.
He sees that as a major potential flashpoint.
I see. And would Iran actually do something like that? I mean, wouldn't they know it would lead to war with the U.S.?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. Wilkerson talks about the internal dynamics within Iranian security circles.
Okay.
You've got the Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Guardian Council, the Ayatollah, and even the new president.
Right.
And there's this tension, he suggests, between the hardliners.
The ones who want to hit Israel hard.
Exactly. And the current president, who, according to Wilkerson, is a bit more hesitant.
Because he doesn't want a full-blown war with the U.S.
Right. He's got enough problems to deal with domestically.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But those hardliners, they might be willing to take the risk.
Wow. And Wilkerson mentioned something about Netanyahu too, right?
Yeah, he raises this unsettling possibility that Netanyahu might actually want the U.S. to get involved.
Wow. Why would he want that?
Well, remember those Iranian air defenses?
Yeah, the S-400 and all that.
Right. Wilkerson suggests that Netanyahu might be hoping for the U.S. to go in and neutralize those defenses.
So it would be easier for Israel to strike Iran later on.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a pretty cynical take, but it's worth considering.
So if all this happened, if there was a war, what would be the impact on Israel?
Well, Wilkerson anticipates heavy losses for the U.S. military.
Like how heavy?
He specifically mentions F-35s, F-15s, F-16s, F-18s.
These are our top-of-the-line fighters.
Exactly. And he cites a 30% attrition rate based on those war game simulations.
So we'd lose almost a third of our aircraft.
Yeah, potentially.
But for Israel, it would be even worse, right?
Yeah, because of their size and their location.
Right.
He reminds us that Israel has a population of around 9 million people.
Right.
Roughly divided between Jewish and Palestinian populations.
Right.
And he compares Israel's size to that of Greater London.
Wow, that's a really small area.
Yeah, very vulnerable. And if you think about the intensity of the fighting in Gaza, the ordnance used there, Wilkerson suggests that a full-scale Iranian attack could be absolutely devastating for Israel.
How devastating are we talking?
He's referencing military casualty models that estimate well over 100,000 casualties, maybe even 200,000.
Wow. That's almost unimaginable.
Yeah, and he emphasizes the importance of understanding the difference between WIA and KIA.
Wounded in action versus killed in action.
Right. Because of advances in battlefield medicine, a lot more people are surviving these injuries.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean they're okay.
Right. They're still severely injured.
Exactly. A high WIA number indicates a lot of people who are going to require extensive medical care and long-term rehabilitation. He points to the Israeli Defense Forces in Lebanon. They had potentially over 4,000 WIA.
So even if you don't die, you could still be permanently disabled.
Yeah, it's a stark reality of modern warfare. And Wilkerson also paints this picture of massive internal displacement within Israel.
Like people fleeing their homes.
Yeah, potentially even leading to long-term evacuations. He mentions a contact in Tel Aviv who's reporting that a huge number, maybe 1 million people, have already left since October 7th.
Wow. So just to shift gears a little bit, Wilkerson tells this really interesting and kind of shady story about the U.S.-Israel relationship.
Right. He brings up this guy named Pard.
Pard.
Yeah. Apparently, he was involved in providing intelligence to Israel.
What?
Both CIA and Russian assets.
Wow.
And the really damaging part is that Israel allegedly turned around and shared this information with the Soviet Union.
Why would they do that?
Well, supposedly in exchange for the Soviets allowing Jewish emigration.
So they traded U.S. intelligence for the release of Soviet Jews.
Yeah, that's what Wilkerson claims. And it really crippled U.S. intelligence operations within the Soviet Union.
That's a pretty big betrayal.
Yeah. And get this, Wilkerson suggests that this same guy, Pard, is now involved in Netanyahu's propaganda efforts.
Really? What kind of propaganda?
Stuff related to Gaza and Lebanon.
So this guy's been operating in the shadows for a long time.
Seems like it. And this whole story, according to Wilkerson, highlights the long and complex and often messy relationship between the U.S. and Israel.
Yeah, it definitely does. And it's not the only example, right? He also talks about Mark Rich.
Right. Bill Clinton pardoned him in one of his last acts as president.
Yeah, that was a controversial one.
Definitely. Wilkerson says it was a really questionable move.
Why? What was so bad about Mark Rich?
Well, apparently his company played a key role in selling discounted oil to Israel.
Okay.
And Wilkerson argues that this was a major factor in Israel's economic success, especially when Netanyahu was finance minister. But it gets even more complicated. Wilkerson also claims that Rich was involved in facilitating oil shipments to Israel from some pretty surprising places.
Like where?
Saddam Hussein's Iraq, for one.
Wow.
And Syria.
Really?
Yeah, and even from the Kurdish region of northern Iraq.
So he was wheeling and dealing all over the Middle East.
Yeah, basically. And Wilkerson uses this as a backdrop to explain some of Netanyahu's current strategic objectives.
Okay, like what?
Specifically, he points to Israel's acquisition of those offshore gas fields that belong to Lebanon.
Right, the ones that were supposed to be for Gaza.
Exactly. Wilkerson argues that this secures Israel's energy needs for decades to come.
Wow.
And it really underscores the strategic importance of controlling the northern Gaza coastline.
Because that's where those gas reserves are.
Exactly. So you see how all this is connected.
Yeah, it's a pretty tangled web.
Definitely. So to sum it all up, what have we learned from Colonel Wilkerson?
Yeah, what are the key takeaways here?
Well, first of all, we've seen that this idea of an easy air war against Iran, it's probably not realistic.
Right, those air defenses are a serious problem.
Yeah. And then there's the possibility, the very real possibility, that the U.S. could actually lose a war with Iran.
Yeah, that's based on those wargaming simulations.
Right. And the potential consequences of a full-blown war, they're pretty terrifying.
Yeah, for both the U.S. and Israel.
Especially for Israel, given their size and their vulnerability.
Right. And then we've got all these historical and political factors at play.
Yeah, this complicated relationship between the U.S. and Israel, the role of oil, the shadow figures operating behind the scenes.
It's a lot to take in.
It is, but I think it's crucial to understand these things if we want to have an informed discussion about Iran.
Yeah, definitely. This deep dive into Wilkerson's perspective really forces you to rethink some basic assumptions.
Yeah, about the military balance of power, about the potential outcomes of a conflict.
It's not just about what's in the headlines. It's about understanding the deeper currents.
Exactly. And it raises some really important questions for all of us to consider.
Yeah, like what?
Well, given everything we've discussed, what are the long-term consequences of either going to war with Iran or choosing to avoid conflict?
Right.
What are the ripple effects? How would it reshape the geopolitical landscape?
Yeah, those are big questions.
They are, but I think they're worth pondering.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks for taking us on this deep dive.
You're welcome. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, it has. And thanks all of you for listening.
Yeah, we encourage you to keep exploring this issue.
It's a crucial one for our times.
Definitely. And we'll be back soon with another deep dive.
So stay tuned.